a warm welcome to our side event at the UN Oceans Conference held virtually on marine geoengineering, a growing threat in the name of climate protection. My name is Linda Schneider and I work with the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Berlin. So what is it that we're discussing today, and what is marine geoengineering? So marine geoengineering, from our perspective, is a growing concern. And we've got a range of speakers today who will talk about different aspects of why we are concerned about marine geoengineering. It is something that's currently being advanced by industry and by some governments in the name of addressing the climate crisis. And it is a growing threat to marine environments and ecosystems, and of increasing concern to local and international climate activists and experts, and also indigenous peoples and scientists. We'll watch a very short animation video first that will give you a bit of an overview and an introduction to the topic of marine geoengineering. And we'll dive into some presentations and Q&A with our speakers right after that. And I want to now segue into the final part of our event today and talk a bit more about governance and international regulation of marine geoengineering. The London Convention, London Protocol has been mentioned a few times, and our final speaker, David Sotillo from Greenpeace, has now also joined, and he's been working on masked up. It's been working on marine geoengineering for a really long time as well, and has been following the discussions at the London Convention and London Protocol very closely, and will be able to give us some really, hopefully, exciting updates on what the London Convention, London Protocol is up to in terms of marine geoengineering, and perhaps further regulation of marine geoengineering approaches and technologies. So yeah, over to you, David, and thanks for joining.
Thank you, Linda. Can you hear me? Thanks, everyone, and my apologies for joining late. We have an event going on here within our labs today, but I've just been released from that, and I'll just give you 5 minutes of an update of where things stand with the London Convention, London Protocol. I will try, I can't share my screen, but never mind. So essentially, within the London Convention and London Protocol, which started out, of course, as a group of conventions that were much more about preventing pollution from dumping of waste at sea, and perhaps is not immediately a place that you would think of in terms of regulating marine geoengineering. I think I can probably now share my screen. I can.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah. So I'm hoping that you can see some very simple slides. So within the London Convention and Protocol, we tried to get some interest in marine geoengineering even as long ago as 1999. I think at that point there wasn't really any regulatory interest because it felt like something that was a theoretical concept rather than something that was round the corner in terms of a potential impact. What changed all that, though, were the proposals from a number of companies around 2006, 2007, that really demonstrated the reality of companies that were really interested in doing ocean fertilization, primarily iron fertilization. And it was the London Convention scientific groups that first flagged its statement of concern in 2007. And that rapidly led then in 2008 to an agreement from the governing bodies that ocean fertilization, other than for legitimate scientific research, should not be allowed. So it was those actors coming into the consciousness of everyone and proposing to do some of these big schemes on the basis that they were going to sequester carbon that really gilded the international community into action. what's happened since then, of course, is that the focus is not just on marine, on ocean iron fertilization, but on lots of other marine geoengineering activities. And over time, the London Protocol developed an amendment that was designed to put in legal force those controls on ocean fertilization, but also to enable future regulation of other marine geoengineering techniques as that became important. What we're now seeing from the London Convention, London Protocol, is a recognition that in recent years there have been a proliferation of different actors, companies, organizations, governments that are talking about marine geoengineering. More money coming through, lots of private equity that are going into this. And that is now beginning to focus minds again on coming back to that agreement to look at other marine geoengineering techniques and what else can be regulated. Some old names, but also lots of new names and projects. It's still a limited amount of information being shared about these activities between public bodies, and also very little regulatory process since in the last couple of years, partly because of the COVID pandemic. So the UN group of experts, GISAMP, issued a report on marine geoengineering in 2019. You can see that that report here, the high-level review of a wide range of techniques. That was supposed to be the basis for that, taking that conversation forward towards regulation. But of course, we had COVID in between, and that slowed things down. This year, at the scientific groups meeting in April, GISAMP gave its updated summary, looking again at a number of different marine geoengineering techniques and deciding what the ones were that they saw as a priority. And they summarized with these 7 activities that they were particularly concerned about and that are now being taken forward within an intersessional correspondence group being led by Italy. So those are aspects of marine geoengineering that are of a scale and of a level of interest that mean that they should now be on the agenda considering regulation. Fertilization for fish stock enhancement, not necessarily for carbon removal. Cultivating large areas under macroalgae, including floating areas, floating structures to carry these macroalgae. The use of microbubbles or other reflective particles in order to reflect back some of the sunlight from the surface. Marine cloud brightening, which I'm sure you've talked about as well. Alkalinization of the oceans by adding alkaline material directly in or by changing the electrochemistry of the oceans. And then looking to mineralize CO2 in rocks under the seabed, and the extraction of CO2 directly from seawater being 2 perhaps more marginal ones at the moment, but could be on the horizon for the future. So what the intersessional group is charged to do by the governing bodies is to look at which of these activities are already regulated under dumping, which of them are already potentially regulated under ocean fertilization, which activities are perhaps a new type of marine geoengineering that's not currently listed under the London Protocol, but which should be, and then activities that perhaps fall outside of the scope of the London Convention and Protocol and should be addressed elsewhere. That work is ongoing. There is a technical meeting next week that will go through some of the proposals, and the next meeting of the governing bodies will be in the autumn, when the proposals from this correspondence group will be made, and those bodies will be able to consider which, if any, of those 7 techniques it takes forward for regulation. So I'll stop at that point and stop sharing my screen, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions if I can.
Thank you, David. That's super interesting. And maybe perhaps as a first follow-up question, so maybe among the 7 potential approaches that the London Convention, London Protocol already listed as of potential concern, what's your sense? Which ones, perhaps either from your experience or from what you picked up from the conversations at the London Convention, London Protocol, which ones are the ones that you see perhaps most relevant, or where there's the fastest growing interest perhaps?
Yeah, I think there are a couple that are of particular concern to me. Both, I mean, I'm a marine biologist, so some of the direct concerns for impacts on the marine environment and they're also ones that are getting a lot of money for research and a lot of interest from governments. And those would be the attempts to change the alkalinity of the oceans by putting in large volumes of alkaline material. I think some of that is being assessed at the moment within the European Union, but I think there's a lot of companies that are interested in doing that. And that, of course, is going to lead to, if it goes ahead, a lot of material being put into the ocean. And when you start changing the chemistry on that kind of scale, you can have a wide range of unintended consequences. So that one, I think, is a key one. And for me, the other one, I think, is perhaps either the changing the albedo, so putting in reflective particles or bubbles, glass beads, those kinds of things, which are presented as being relatively inert, but I think could be anything of the sort when you're starting to deal with impacts on the marine environment. Or perhaps the big culture of macroalgae, because those are being envisaged to be huge floating mats, some of which will then be designed to sink to the seabed. And I think they need to be properly assessed and addressed, and if possible, regulated so that we're under the same level of control as we are with ocean fertilization. Time will tell, of course, what the parties to the London Convention and Protocol decide.
Okay, I think David's breaking up a little bit. Now it's better. Okay, now I think we're back. Yeah, thanks. And everyone, you're welcome to ask your questions in the chat or just raise your hand. But another question that I had is, to what extent you think that so, I guess the marine geoengineering framework, governance framework, is in a way, one of the most advanced, perhaps, regulatory frameworks that we have for geoengineering. Many of the other geoengineering technologies are far less governed internationally. And I wanted to ask you to what extent you think that the marine geoengineering governance framework could be a potential blueprint for other types of geoengineering regulation, perhaps particular because it looks at the potential impacts and effects on the ecosystem that's being targeted, as opposed to the the stated objective, perhaps, of the technology. But also perhaps you can talk a bit more about what challenges you also see, perhaps when it comes to the legal force of the governance frameworks that we currently have, and what we can do or what's needed to make that more powerful and more legally binding, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you. And my apologies for the background noise here. There seems to be someone doing some gardening just on the same site. But yes, I think what we had in the case of ocean fertilization, although the London Convention and Protocol weren't initially set up to deal with that, they had a lot of the tools in place because they were dealing often with very similar methods of application, basically introducing large quantities of material into the marine environment for the purpose of disposal. So if you start looking at impacts of marine geoengineering with iron fertilization, you're thinking in the same frame as those parties had always been thinking. And that's why the tools that they had could be adapted to regulate ocean fertilization relatively in a relatively straightforward way. One thing that the governing bodies of those instruments will be doing later in this year is looking at whether the instruments that they have, whether the guidance that they have for assessment is actually suitable to deal with some of those other methods as well, or whether they would need to start again or to adapt something more fundamentally. So those discussions are going to happen, I think, in the coming 12 months. In the interim, the important message to get out is that it's not going unnoticed in regulatory terms, that there is an intention to see what can be regulated. I'll just say very quickly then, one of the concerns that we have is that there have been countries that have allowed ocean fertilization even to go ahead, even recently, on the basis that the legal change to the protocol has not yet entered into force. And I think what we need to remind them is that, in fact, those resolutions are the key driving force at the moment for those amendments, but those resolutions in themselves have political force. So if countries are minded to, they can regulate ocean fertilization in their jurisdiction by applying the terms of those resolutions that were agreed more than 10 years ago and to which there was a consensus support. So I'm talking in particular perhaps about Australia, that has presented the fact that they don't have regulations as a way of explaining why they've let the Whale X project go ahead, for example, without proper assessment. They don't need to do that. The tools are there. They signed up to them in the resolutions.
Yeah, thanks for that. And maybe I don't know if you mentioned, if you touched on that earlier, but do you wanna say a few more words on if you think that the marine geoengineering framework could be a potential blueprint for other types of regulation for other ecosystems, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it could be, but of course there's nothing equivalent that would regulate atmospheric activities. What we had with the London Convention and Protocol is almost a ready-made system that you could adapt to deal with many types of marine geoengineering, but it doesn't have jurisdiction beyond the marine environment. So I think many of the principles that are there in the assessment, many of the principles that are there in the pre-screening that prevents things that are commercially driven as being recognized as legitimate scientific research, I think those can be read across as a blueprint, but the specifics of atmospheric modification, for example, would need, I think, a different basis to start from, even if it can learn from what the London Convention and Protocol have done.
Yeah, that makes sense.